so here we are in beautiful Hawaii. It's a very fetching Hawaiian shirt you have there, Myron.
Well, thank you so much.
For this training flight, we've discarded the uniforms, clearly, because there's no passengers to impress. Just before we start about the aeroplane, last night when we were having dinner, you told me a great little story about a delicacy of this island, because Hawaii's made up of a bunch of islands, isn't it? And we're on one of them at the moment.
Exactly, yeah. The Hawaiian Islands are a series of 5 or 6 islands, and we would fly to Honolulu, and then we would fly to Maui, and then the Big Island, which is actually called Hawaii. And Kona is on the Big Island of Hawaii, and there's another airport that we used to use over on the east side, the southeast side, called Hilo. And Kona is a big, long runway. It is a very nice place to go. But we were talking last night about one of the delicacies that was good to buy, and it's called Loco Moco. It's a combination of rice and a hamburger and egg and some brown gravy over all of it. And it would last all the way to Chicago. I mean, it was a really long, lasting delicacy.
How far is Chicago? For how many hours is Chicago?
It's about 8 hours.
Wow!
So it would last a long time.
That's some in-flight meal. So there you go. There's a little story about Hawaii for you.
And believe me, it was better than most of the airline food, as everybody will.
As everyone, I think Air America has top awards for in-flight catering.
Fantastic.
So here we are then. This is the aeroplane. Can you remember the first time you stepped out and actually saw the airplane in real life?
Well, I do. It was on my initial operating experience, my IOE, and that's where you do 25 hours of getting experience actually flying the airplane. The type rating is all obtained in the simulator, and so the first time you actually fly the airplane, you have passengers in the back and a very experienced senior captain in the right-hand seat who makes sure that you don't do something stupid. And so part of the initial operating experience is figuring out what a pre-flight would be. Even though captains typically didn't do the pre-flight, you needed to know how it should be done. And so he would take us around the exterior of the airplane and show us all of the holes and all of the antennas. And as I mentioned before, I was pretty shocked he actually wanted me to know all that stuff. We went over every antenna and every hole in the airplane and figured out what each one of them did. And it was really useful because, as we can see now, I'm finally going to use it 15, 16 years later.
So it's going to come in handy. It was definitely worth doing the homework,
I suppose.
It's a big aeroplane, though, isn't it? And does it feel big and look big? Standing under it, you think, wow, this is a big aeroplane.
It does. One of my favorite pictures, I was standing inside the engine of the 777. You lose all perspective of how big the airplane is. But I was standing inside of the engine with my hand raised above my head, and I couldn't touch the top of the cowling. The cowling is the same size as the fuselage of a 757.
Is that true? Because they say that, and I've often wondered if that is just a kind of an old wives' tale. But is that actually true?
It's actually true, and you can't get the perspective of a 777 unless you actually stand in the cowling of the engine. I kind of disappeared in the intake of the engine. That's how big the 777 is, and it just doesn't look like that. It's perfectly proportioned.
These airplanes come with lots of different engines. Now, I guess from an operating point of view, it doesn't make a huge amount of difference. Some of them are more powerful than others, and there are some display differences and maybe a few handling differences. But is that about it in a nutshell?
Sure. I mean, the thrust settings are a little different. The way you operate the engines are a little different. Some use ITT to manage the temperatures, and some use exhaust gas temperatures. ITT is interturbine temperature, and it is typically much hotter than the exhaust gas temperature. So depending on whether you're looking at ITT or EGT, all of those are measurements of how hot the engine is, but it doesn't really matter. It's just a different way of measuring the same thing.
So for those of us who aren't particularly technically minded, the jet engine's actually pretty simple, isn't it?
It is very simple. You put air down the front of it, you shoot fuel into the engine, and you ignite it, and it drives the turbine section. The turbine section then drives a compressor section, which actually compresses the air and the fuel mixture, and that creates more thrust because it's compressed. And then that all drives a great big fan, which is not all that unlike a propeller on the front of the engine. The fan section is what creates the majority of the thrust. The actual turbine section, the actual hot air coming out the back is almost insignificant in the total thrust being produced by the engine.
And these engines are pretty reliable these days.
Yeah, absolutely reliable. And in fact, part of the extended twin-engine operation, the ETOPS, which you'll hear people talk about when they talk about long-range twin-engine airplanes over water, the ETOPS requirements are such that the engines have to be very reliable. We used Pratt's, there's GE's, there's Rolls-Royce, and I happened to be at a Boeing exhibition the other day, and I said, just for the record, you've never lost an airplane with Pratt's on it. So I would, if I were you, put Pratt's on every airplane.
What do they say? What's the slogan for Pratt & Whitney's dependable power, isn't it? I think, or something like that. So seemingly it's true. Okay, so let's just talk about this initial kind of walk around. First of all, let's kind of replicate a little bit of the thing that you were caught out on by that captain
yes.
all those years ago.
All those years ago.
When we come out here and do the walk around, what is it that we're having a look for?
Well, first of all, it's really important not to fall down the steps. The only reason I mentioned going down the steps is because the 777 is quite high. You've gone to a gate, and that gate may service a 737, and that gate may also service a 777. So the steps, when you get up to a 777, are very, very steep. If they happen to be wet, they're very slippery, and so it's very important to be careful as you go down the steps.
So more than one 777 pilot's landed on the backside of the bottom of the some wet steps before now.
Well, I know of one who's done that.
Right, okay.
I did it in Beijing, and there was they always post a guard at the bottom of the steps, and he never speaks English, but his eyes, you could tell he was very, very frightened about my well-being after I bounced all the way down the steps on the jetway stairs. It was not good.
Okay, so watch the steps. There you go. That's the first little nugget of advice from a veteran 777 captain.
Yeah.
Okay, so here we are. Then we're at the front of the aeroplane. So where do we begin?
So as you come down off of the steps at the front, about where the external power card is, we can go over the holes in the side of the airplane.
Before we do that, actually, because if you've got this aeroplane, you may well have wondered what these two things are that are attached to the airplane.
Sure.
Now, we're running at the moment, we've got the ground power and the external air connected. We'll talk a little bit more about how that happens inside the airplane.
Sure.
But one is giving us the ground power because the engines are switched off, so the airplane needs some power to run, and it also needs some cool air. So can you expand a little bit on what these two things are doing?
Sure. What the electrical power is doing is providing all of the electrical needs of the airplane. And we have two places to hook in external power on the airplane, and one is called primary power and one is called secondary power. And as you see, there's two cords hooking up to the side of the airplane. One of them is primary power and one of them is secondary power. And to power the complete airplane, we need both. All right. So if the APU is not running, the auxiliary power unit is not running, it needs a lot of power. And as you can imagine, it's a big airplane, so there's a lot of systems on the airplane. If you go to one power supply, then part of the airplane will not be powered.
Okay, and we'll look at that when we
go
inside.
on the electrical distribution.
So this particular airplane, it has this little cart standing on the apron. Is it more likely on the line that this is attached to the jetway or comes out of the ground? How are these things normally plugged in?
Typically, they come off the jetway, and once the jetway is attached, then they'll bring the external power and plug it into the airplane. It's part of the normal sequence of events. Jetway power and jetway air conditioning are cheaper than running the APU. And so you will see most of the airplanes that are on the jetway will be supplied by external power and external air just because it's cheaper to run that than it is the APU on the airplane.
Now, the other little box that we've got out here on the apron is this one here, this little cart. and this is the ground air conditioning. Now, what's this doing, and where's it going then, Myron?
Well, first of all, it's really loud, so anytime you're around a ground air conditioning unit, you want hearing protection in, because if you walk by it, it is so loud and so obnoxious that...
and that's what we're listening to here.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
There's all kinds of noise going on the ramp. A lot of it is made by external air card. It is simply a giant air conditioner on wheels, and you're conditioning the outside air, and you're making it cooler, and then you're supplying it directly into the airplane through the supply ducts. In other words, you're not using the air conditioning packs, and you're not supplying the low-pressure air system that would run the packs.
Okay, and it's just using the pressure from the cart to drive that around the airplane. The airplane's not doing anything with this air.
It won't do anything. In fact, one of the limitations is that in order for it to work properly, you have to have the recirculation fans off.
Okay, because when you start when you load up this airplane, the 777, they'll often be left switched on, and actually in the airline world, they want to be switched off.
That's correct.
How long does it take to cool down? I mean, in 777, we're here at Hawaii. It's a nice day, 31 degrees Celsius. I know you American guys are now frantically converting that to Fahrenheit. It's a warm day. That's all we care about.
It's very warm, and typically we were looking for somewhere between 72 and 75 degrees on the cabin temperature indicators in the 777. And so when it's 80 degrees or more, it's really hot. And so you want the ground air-conditioned air to be pumping in something less than that. So you're trying to cool the cabin down, because as soon as you start bringing people on board, the temperature is going to go up. So as we all know, in Fahrenheit, the 98.6 degree bodies are going to bring the temperature up pretty quickly.
Okay, all right, and it's not a lot of fun getting on an airplane that's hot, sticky.
No, it isn't. And part of the problem with ground air conditioners is that they sometimes work and sometimes they pump in kind of lukewarm air.
Okay, all right.
Even though it's cheaper, sometimes it's not the coolest air that you could get.
So the situation there, I'm guessing that the cabin crew would probably pop into the flight deck and say, it's really warm back there, can you help us out, guys? Mm-hmm. And at that point, you turn the APU on and get the airplane cooling itself down.
Yeah, and you shouldn't use both, so at this point, you call the ground crew and tell them to disconnect the external air, and you would bring the APU on. In a situation where you're using outside boarding, it is noisy. I don't know that the APU is any noisier than the external air.
Well, I suppose it's at the other end of the airplane.
It is at the back end. It's pretty noisy, but before we started boarding, I would ask them to pull the external air, start the APU, and make sure it's going to work, number one. And number two, it's a little better at cooling the cabin.
But I guess the APU gotcha is if you wait until literally the last moment to start the APU, and then the APU doesn't start, you've created a problem for yourself right at the last minute.
You have, and that's one of the reasons you'd like to get it up and get it stable and get it just to make sure it's going to work, number one. If it doesn't work, then there's a procedure that you have to go through to get it deferred, because there's some places that you can't fly without an APU, some places that you wouldn't want to fly if you didn't have an APU. So.
Okay, all right. So, for example, if you were flying across the sea, North Atlantic, middle of winter, you've got to divert to Greenland. You don't want to be on the ground at some godforsaken icy little airport, and you've got no way of keeping the cabin warm when the engines are shut down. That's one example.
Correct, exactly. And if you have an engine running, you can only run it for so long, and that's a pretty poor way of keeping the airplane warm.
Back to this walk around then, Myron.
We're looking on the front side of the airplane, and you see a big hole in the airplane. That is the forward outflow valve. We have one of these in the back and one of these in the front. And what this does is control the pressurization. As we go up in altitude, the pressure in the atmosphere goes down, and so what we do is we just pack more air inside the airplane, and that's how we pressurize the airplane, and we control the forward outflow valve and the back outflow valve to trap some air in the cabin, and that drives the cabin altitude down, and that allows us to breathe normally. in 99% of the cases, it's automatically controlled, and it will regulate the amount of air that's escaping from the airplane to control the pressurization inside.
Okay, so we don't, as long as that looks like it's not jammed up and someone's shoved something in it, then
on the ground it should be open. It should be full open. So that's what and that's what it looks like. So that's why it's like that.
Okay.
What we're doing now is we're moving up towards the front of the airplane, the pitot tube. How do you determine how fast you're going through the air? There's an ice detector, which controls the automatic ice. And then there is also a total air temperature gauge there at the top, which allows you to know what the outside air temperature is, and then you can run some algorithms and find out what the static air temperature is.
And in terms of the walk-around, we're just checking that they've not been bashed off by some ground equipment or
sure,
things
absolutely.
Like that. No airspeed and a big problem then.
It's if you plug the pitot tube, then the problem with plugged pitot tubes is that there's no ram air pressure coming in, and the computers on the airplane don't have any idea how fast it's going.
All right, which way are we going to go next?
We would go around the front of the airplane. As far as the nose gear is concerned, you want to make sure that you have some strut extension. That's the silver part. Show some extension and some silver. That's what cushions the nose gear as it
So this
compresses.
is a bit like the shock absorber on your car, really.
It's exactly like that.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly
what are the two things that look like gun barrels? Is that part of that shock absorber system?
No, that's part of the nose wheel steering.
Ah, okay, right.
That's part of the nose wheel steering, and that's how you would steer the airplane on the ground. And in this airplane, there's a tiller that you can access really from either side. Typically, it's the captain's responsibility to run the tiller unless he's incapacitated, and then, of course, the co-pilot can.
And on this airplane, there's one on either side.
There is,
a lot of airplanes, only the 737, and he has it generally on the captain's side.
And most airplanes only have it on the captain's side. Yes.
Okay. I'm guessing these big lights that we're looking at, landing lights and taxi lights we're looking at here, is that correct?
That's exactly right. The two big ones are the landing lights, and the two below it are the taxi lights.
Do they swivel around on this airplane? Because in some airplanes they do.
They are attached to the nose gear, and they will swivel.
Okay,
yes.
all right.
So you can point them in the direction you're going to turn. We also have runway turnoff lights in this airplane, which will illuminate out to about 45 degrees.
Okay.
It makes it easier to see where you're going if you're turning off the runway. There's also a nose gear pin that you want to make sure that it's removed. It'll have a streamer on it, not unlike any other airplane. You just want to make sure that the nose gear pin is removed.
Now, let me just clarify the whole idea of the pins. When you push the aeroplane back, am I right in thinking that they put a pin in the nose gear to lock out the steering? Is that correct?
On this airplane, there will be a pin that locks out the steering. When they hook up the tow bar is when they do that.
Okay.
And so they will pin the hydraulic pressure. So if you inadvertently grab the tiller and move the tiller, the big tow bar that it takes to move a 600,000 or 700,000 pound airplane is something you don't want to be powered by the 3,000 pound hydraulic system.
Yeah. Okay.
So I mean, you can try to move the tug and hopefully the tug is hooked up, which would keep the people from getting hurt. But if the tug is not hooked up, you can actually move the tow bar with it.
So the tow bar would just start swinging around, and
it could, yes,
very bad.
And they don't want the guys on the ground get very angry when you do that.
I imagine they probably do. So the pin for the pushback is for that reason. That is a separate thing to the pin where they're pinning the gear.
Yes, it is.
Now that, as I understand it, is a maintenance thing, isn't it? That they don't want the airplane to fall over on the ground.
Right.
So as a kind of safety measure, if you like, they put some pins in to stop that happening. Is that kind of how it works?
And typically that's not something that you see when you come to the airplane. All those pins are removed.
So the worst case scenario is if we take off with the pin in, the gear won't come up.
That's correct.
And then you've got to come back, and it's all a bit embarrassing.
Yeah, it is, and it can be very expensive nowadays because in the bigger airplanes that have an ability to dump fuel, typically you're taking off at a weight that's above your max landing weight. So the max takeoff weight will be as much as 150,000 pounds above your maximum landing weight. Well, the only way to come right back around and land is to dump all that fuel.
Okay.
And so you're just destroying that much gas.
So I've no idea how much it costs to fill the tanks on a 777, but I bet it's quite a bit of cash.
From Chicago or Washington Dulles to China, our typical fuel loads were 225,000 pounds.
Right, okay.
And it's around 6.7 pounds per gallon, so you can do the math. I don't do math in public anymore.
I don't do the maths. I'm sure someone somewhere will work out the fuel price per gallon and tell us how much it costs. But I guess going to the filling station and sticking that in your credit card that's a bit of money. Right. Okay, so is there anything else in the nose gear that we've got to think about there, or is it just checking the tires and wear and that kind of thing?
We used to check the tire pressure, but that became a maintenance function, and so if there's obviously a tire that's flat, then you would contact maintenance and get them to pump the tire up, or fix the tire if it happens to have a cut or an imperfection on the tire. So you're just checking the general condition. We'll talk a little bit about what we see here. And again, you see two of the pitot tubes, and just below the City of Angels, there'll be an angle of attack vane, another temperature indicator. Again, you just want to make sure that those aren't bent or clogged. And again, it's hard to see from the ground. So
you need to pay attention to that.
Yep.
And then you have a little, there's a little hatch here on the front of the aeroplane. Is this to get into the electronics bay, which is under the flight deck?
It is, and there's a light in the airplane that will tell you when that bay has been opened. If it's open, then you want to make sure that the technicians are in fact working on that, and you want to make sure that it's closed prior to leaving.
Okay, you don't want to be taxiing out with that thing open.
No, I mean it's just a hole in the airplane, and it needs to be closed.
Okay, all right. Can you actually get, some aeroplanes you can actually climb from the flight deck through, and kind of hatch out into the ground. Can you actually do that on a 777?
We never did. And there is access to some of the things below the flight deck from the cabin, but typically that door is locked and it's not accessible by anybody other than the crew.
Okay. All right.
We just slide back the side of the airplane. You're checking the doors closed, the general condition of the right side of the airplane. Sometimes catering would use that door if they wanted to bring things in at the front of the airplane. The emergency lights will light that area. It would illuminate the slide if you were going to do an emergency evacuation in the dark.
Okay, so that's all it's for. And then you'll probably notice this little slanty line going across the top of the door. Am I right in thinking that's just to stop rain from dripping into the airplane?
That's exactly right. And it's just like, before all cars were the way they are now, in the old days, they all had rain channels above the doors to keep you from getting wet when you had the door open and you were sitting in the car. Now they've all gone by the wayside, but they're still here on the 777.
Okay, 777 still has them. Let's talk a little bit about this whole kind of ground handling loading thing. Some airplanes, they just throw the bags into the hold.
Sure.
So you'll see your suitcase being thrown up in there. That doesn't happen with the triple, generally speaking.
Typically, what we will do is load all of the bags into containers. And the containers, this is called a container handling piece of equipment, and it will bring the containers up and it will put them in, and then his panel will allow him to move those containers back into the cargo hold of the 777.
So are there little runners inside, and they run on the little wheels that...
The inside of the airplane is not entirely different from what you see here. You can actually manipulate the containers in the cargo floor of the airplane just like you can on this piece of equipment.
Do different airplanes have different containers, or is there a standard container for pretty much every airplane?
Most of the big airplanes have a standard container. The smaller airplanes, like a 737, don't have any containers typically.
They just throw them in.
And that's why you see, the guys with knee pads on climbing up the beltway. The belt loader for a small airplane is that they're going to go in there on their hands and knees and grab all the bags out. This can be done a lot more civilized. We have baggage loading on the 777 at the back in the airplane. We'll look at that in a minute. But that will allow us to load loose bags.
Okay. It's stuff that doesn't make the containers, basically.
Yes. It's mostly the things that are loaded at the last minute.
So is a ramp quite a dangerous place?
Sure. That's part of the problem that you have walking around the airplane. It's really dangerous because you can get run over pretty easily as you're out there on the tarmac trying to do the pre-flight inspection. That's why I never went out.
You send the first officer; he's expendable.
Right, yeah.
Okay, so you're trying to do the walk around while these guys are trying to do their job as well.
Yeah, everybody has a job to do out there, and that's what you have to understand. It is a dangerous place, so be careful when you're out there, absolutely.
So we move back a little bit. You'll notice here there are a couple of windows that are blanked out. Now, I'm guessing that in this aeroplane, perhaps that's for the galleys, but some aeroplanes are configured differently. There'd be a window there.
Sure, absolutely. That's the only reason that those are blanked out is because in this particular airplane, in that configuration, you're going to have something blocking those. And there's no sense in having a window there.
So it could be the galley, it could be a lavatory, it could be whatever. The 777 comes in many different flavors.
It does.
And do aeroplanes get reconfigured through their lives as well? Where you'll start out where there was a window, and then the config will change, and that will end up as a galley and all the rest of it. And you've got a window cut out, so you've got to fill it.
Absolutely true. And so it depends on what configuration that particular airplane is in at that time.
Okay. And then when it becomes a freighter at the end of its life, they all get filled.
That's right.
All right. We can see under the aeroplane now there's a bunch of different aerials and stuff like that. Now, I don't think there's any need to go into kind of vast details about what every single one of these does, but I'm guessing these are stuff for navigation. So it's NDB aerials, VHF, and DME, and all of that kind of stuff.
We have some radar altimeter. They call it radio altimeters.
That's
all pilots in the world seems to call it radar altimeters, but it's really radio.
Yeah. Okay.
So if you're looking for it to defer it, if it's not working, then you look for radio altimeters. But it actually measures the distance between your airplane and the ground.
Okay.
And so that's and we'll see it in the airplane as we fly. We'll look at how high we are above touchdown, and it matters if we're doing, for example, an auto land. The aircraft has to know exactly how high it is above the ground to know when to flare and to know when to touch down.
And on the ground, if you look in the flight deck, it says -2
right
when the aeroplane is level.
If you look at the gear on the approach, hangs down a bit in the back.
Okay.
All right. And that's the 2 feet. That's where you get the 2 feet. So if you look at the radar altimeter, not that you would be, but if you were looking at the radar altimeter when those aft wheels touch, it would be 0.
Okay. And then when the nose gear comes down.
Well, when the trunk of the main gear rotates to level,
okay, yeah,
then it will be 0.
Right, okay.
And then, as it kind of settles down, it'll be -2.
Got you. All right. So if you've ever wondered why is this -2 on the ground, that's why. It's taking account of the angle of the gear.
Yes.
Got you.
Exactly.
All right, cool.
Yeah.
So we're looking at a bunch of different aerials here. We don't need to get hung up on those, but
right.
We just want to make sure that they're there. They're not hanging off. They've not been dented.
Yeah, some of them are VHF radios, and there's a drain mask, and all that does is if you look at that and you walk under it at the wrong time, it may be a laboratory drain mask.
Okay.
And so you can get wet when you...
Okay, that sounds a bit unappealing. Now, that's all the stuff from the lavatories. That goes into a tank, doesn't it? There's just going to be water at the, hopefully.
Yes.
Okay.
It is wash basin water.
Okay.
Yeah.
So soapy water is the worst it can be.
Exactly.
Okay.
Theoretically, yeah.
All right. and that is heated in the air, and it says hot on it.
Sure.
Because otherwise it would freeze.
Yes.
And you'd have a big icicle coming out the back of the airplane.
Yeah. That would be a bad thing.
So you don't want to touch that on the ground.
No. And you can't. I mean, you can't reach that high.
Really?
Yeah.
So just to give a bit of perspective about how high this is, because it's kind of difficult to do in the sim, let's say the landing gear there, where would the top of that landing gear wheel come on you, for example?
Oh, gosh.
Are we talking kind of like, I don't know, top of your legs
at least waist high.
Really? Wow.
Yeah. That's how big the airplane is. And again, it's proportional, so it doesn't look that big until you actually get out and start walking around it.
We've got a bunch of stuff here, kind of right under the wing box, including two big kind of louvered vents
right
here. and that's the beacon. That red thing in the middle is the beacon, isn't it? The flashing red beacon.
Flashing red beacon.
And it says warning on it. Why is it saying warning on there?
Well, those are the exhausts for our air cycle machines, and that's what makes the pressurization. That's what pumps the air and conditions the air in the airplane. And so when we transition from the external air like we have on it now to the pack air, we have a left pack and a right pack. Ergo, we have two exhaust vents that are going to pump air out. Just a little further forward on the fuselage, where the air intakes for those packs.
So that's like a scoop, isn't it?
It's like a scoop, and on the ground it sucks air in, and then it blows it out. Where we were just looking at the louvers, there's big doors that you can open up and look at all of the pack operation. They're just behind the external air hookups, and so you could actually open those doors and work on the packs when the airplane is on the ground.
So sometimes these the little, we can almost see like the little, they're not screws, are they kind of like latches?
They're latches, so that you can open that area. And obviously now, if you know what you're looking at, you can see the intake, you can see where you could work on the pack, and then you can see the exhaust louvers. In the old days, the outflow valves would have nicotine streaks coming from the airplane.
Wow.
It was really disgusting.
From when people were smoking?
From people were smoking.
All right, so we've arrived
at the main landing
gear.
landing
gear on the right side, yeah.
And again, you're checking for the tires to make sure that they don't have cuts or abrasions or flat spots. Each individual airline kind of sets the guidelines for when they'll replace a tire. Some say that if it's got a big flat spot on it, if it's showing 3 layers of cord or 4 layers of cord, that's when some of them get replaced.
So we've got some Bridgestone tires here. I'm guessing there are different companies that make, and in fact you can actually see the tire size. They're 52 times 210 R22, so these are pretty big rims. How long does it take to change one of these things if they've got to do it?
I've seen them do it in 30 to 35 minutes.
Wow.
It's really quick. That's a good crew, knowing what they're doing and being fully motivated, because typically they want to go home.
Yeah,
it's 11 o'clock at night,
Yeah, so these things always happen at the wrong
they
time.
Do.
They know it's going to be 2 o'clock in the morning at JFK in January, and it's minus 20.
Yeah. And then it's not a 35-minute job.
No, I bet it's not. So this airplane has chocks in. This is part of the thing about this particular airplane, is you've got to have the chocks in to make things happen. Now, you were saying that chocks themselves can present some challenges.
They can. In the old days, the chocks would be positioned as you see them here, not actually jammed in underneath the wheels. As you put fuel on the airplane tends to settle a little bit. If you push the chock in hard, then it'll be really, really difficult to get out after you fuel the airplane.
How do they do it?
They take another chock, they bang on it, they
swear a lot.
Yes, and ultimately they get it out, but it's not easy.
I mean, do airplanes roll away? Have airplanes rolled away before now?
Well, typically not on the ramp. The biggest hazard for operating an airplane on the tarmac is once you get the tow bar connected. And once you get the tow bar connected and attached at both ends, then the airplane should be secure. However, occasionally the tow bars will break, and one of the things that you got to be careful of is if you're going back at a high rate of speed, if you put the brakes on pretty dramatically, the airplane can tip
onto the tail.
Wow. So that's not a good thing to have happen. So we instituted at the airline I was at a call out to say that you were no longer connected to the tug, and the call out was breakaway. And as you were pushing back, if it said breakaway, then you knew to apply the brakes very gently until the airplane came to a complete stop, and then set the parking brake and figure out what was going on.
And all these cables that we can see, is this stuff for the brakes or the hydraulics or a bit of both?
Well, it's hydraulics for the brakes. Obviously, it goes to each of the individual brakes. So you got to get hydraulic pressure, and you can see the lines running to the brake pucks. So there's all of those lines coming down, and as you pre-flight it, you're checking to make sure that those are
Okay.
Those are okay.
All right. And then they will all, as you can see, as you go up the gear, they combine from lots of pipes into fewer pipes and fewer, and then they vanish off inside the airplane.
Right. It's like any other airplane that you've ever pre-flighted or looked around. It is, it's just bigger.
This is the landing gear bay that we can see here. So this is the bit when people stow away. This is the bit that they generally climb into.
Yeah, and it's really bad because if you look to the left of the strut brace, you'll see that the door has to open first for the gear to come up.
Right, okay.
And so if you're a stowaway, you have to figure out a place that you're not going to fall out when the gear door opens.
The floor falls away, basically.
Absolutely true.
Wow.
It's a really bad idea to try and hide in the landing gear because it's unpressurized as well.
And it's not heated, so it's going to be incredibly cold.
You'll either suffocate or freeze to death.
Okay.
Or be damaged by the retraction of the gear.
So the moral of the story is don't stow away. It's a very, very bad idea.
It's a really bad idea.
Okay.
Yeah. This is a pretty important one.
Okay.
You know, as you walk around the airplane, this is where the rat will fall out, and it's a ram air turbine.
Okay.
And
not a rodent.
No, it's not a rodent. You know, if that door opens, there's going to be a propeller drop out into the slipstream in the air. And there are certain times, and we'll talk about them, when it automatically will deploy. But on the ground, if you actuate the switch in the cockpit, this will come out. So if you're walking around and you're standing directly under this and somebody is screwing around in the cockpit and doesn't really truly understand what it is they're doing, they can actuate the rat and
this will hit you on the head.
They can hit you on the head.
Okay, all right. So so it's kind of considered bad luck to stand around under this. It's a bit like walking under a ladder, really.
Yeah, it can really hurt you if it comes out. The landing lights and the turn-off light are in the wing root there, right up next to the fuselage. So you want to make sure that those are on. They're not on the walk-around, but you want to make sure that the bulbs don't look black or discolored because that would indicate that the bulb is burned out. So There's a couple bulbs in there. One's a landing light, one's a turn-off light.
Okay.
I don't know that you can see that on the.
Are they? So yeah, I mean, I think from what we can see, that it looks like one's angled one way and one's angled another way. So am I right in thinking that the one that looks out to the side is the turn-off light?
Exactly.
And then the one that faces forward is the landing light?
Sure.
Got
yeah.
You. All right.
So absolutely right.
Okay.
And they're both in the leading edge there. If we go out to the engine now, what you're looking for with the fan blade is to make sure that there's no nicks or indentations or cracks in any of the fan blades. There's very low clearance between the ends of the fan blades and what's called a rub strip. And that rub strip actually kind of seals the air so it doesn't escape. And that provides pretty good thrust. So you're going to look at that rub strip. As you can see, the fan blades go right up against that rub strip, and that's what prevents the air from leaking back out of the fan. So if that rub strip is missing or it has gapes in it, then that's a bad thing because you're going to lose thrust.
Okay, all right. And would you stick your hand in? And because you often see pilots, they stick their hand in and give it a. I mean, I guess moving one of these by hand is probably quite difficult. Is it?
Sometimes they're spinning on their own because of the wind. I never reached in there and touched it. First of all, I don't believe, if I remember correctly, that you can reach it.
Okay.
From the cowling without crawling up into the engine. And I never.
No, you're not going to be doing that.
I'm not doing that.
No, that's fair enough.
That's a really bad idea.
Okay.
So no, you can tell everything you need to tell by just looking at it. You know.
It has this little twirly thing on the cone.
Yeah, that just makes it easy to tell when the engine is starting or when it's running. And you don't want to get sucked into one of these engines. It's a really bad thing. And so there's caution ranges out around the front of the engine so that you don't get sucked in. That's where you can stand and not get sucked into the engine, the red line. If you go ahead of that line, then that's what's going to happen is that you can get sucked around the edge and you can get ingested into the engine.
Right, so you don't want to stand forward of this line.
No, sir.
Okay, so that's what that red line is for, and that's what it's showing you.
Right. You're also looking to make sure that the reversers are not actuated, and whatever you can see is normal. And
all right, so there's the engine. So it's a good look around the engine condition and oil leaks and all that kind of stuff.
Shouldn't be anything leaking out of it underneath it.
So we're at the leading edge of the wing now. So what are you more interested in here? Is it stuff like the condition of the wing, of the leading edge?
Yeah, you're looking for the leading edge condition to make sure that there's no dents or anything. You can look at one of the refueling panels, and so you could open that, and if they were refueling the airplane, they might have one hooked up to that. There's one on each side for the 777.
When you arrive at the airplane at the gate, let's say you're going to go on a very long flight, you're off to China. I imagine filling a 777 for a China flight is going to take a long time.
It does take a long time, and typically for the longer flights, it would be fueled pretty close to the maximum that you wanted prior to arrival at the airplane, and then they would just pump a little bit extra to make sure that you had enough.
Okay, all right. So they don't want to give you too much.
Yeah, and that is a moving target, obviously. Sometimes the day before they're planning a full flight, and for example, the weather turns bad at one of the connecting stations, and those people can't make the connection, so now you have a half full airplane instead of a full airplane, then you don't need nearly as much fuel to get to your destination.
So that's why they'll undershoot on that figure and then top you up.
And then top you off, right? And it's a kind of an on-time performance kind of thing, too. If you waited till you got the final fuel load and the airplane had flown in and landed with 15,000 pounds, and you're trying to go to China with it now, and the fuel load is 235,000 pounds, then it takes a long time to pump that much fuel. So they'd pump the majority of it prior to your arrival, and then you'd get topped off.
An airplane, when it's just landed, 777, the average 777 is going to land with about 15,000 pounds on it.
In round numbers, yes. Some of the domestics might land a little less than that. And if you have really, really bad weather and a couple alternates coming from a long way, you could end up with 20,000 or 22,000.
Okay.
In fact, that number has gone down over the years. We used to typically land in D.C. With about 22,000 pounds of fuel, and then just before I left, it was everybody had gotten more comfortable with landing with 17 or maybe even a little less.
What's your personal kind of limit on the amount of fuel you want to land with?
I want the wheels on the ground. I don't care where, but I want the wheels on the ground with a minimum of 10,000 pounds.
Okay. Now, 10,000 pounds of fuel sounds quite a lot, but what does a 777 burn an hour,
well,
in round figures?
In round numbers, it's 10,000 pounds an hour.
So that's an hour.
That's anywhere between 45 minutes and an hour. But in round numbers, if you weren't on the ground with 10,000 pounds, I was really nervous.
It's just not a lot. It's not a lot of fuel, is it?
It's not a lot of gas.
No.
Not in a big airplane.
All right. So that's some fuel. So we're looking at the wing. We're looking at the leading edge. We're looking at the condition, that everything is good.
Right.
And then we arrive at the end of the wing, and we've got some more lights.
You do. And part of dispatch reliability is making sure that you have pretty much two of everything. And so there's a couple wing tip lights. The green light you see there is the same on every airplane. It's a green wingtip light. The red's on the left, the green's on the right. And you see on the back of this wingtip that it has a white light as well. All right, so that white light is there on the wingtip because it's easier to change, right, than the one on the tail. Also out on the wingtip, there's a strobe light, which you could see directly aft of the green light. It is it's typically not on the Walkaround because the strobe lights are really obnoxious, particularly at night.
Is it really bad form to sit at the gate with the strobes on?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
And even when the maintenance technicians are testing the lights, which they'll do periodically, it's really obnoxious when they turn the strobes on.
So they don't leave them on for long?
No, it's just to make sure that they're going to work.
And we see these little, I believe they're called wicks. Is that right?
Yeah, they're static wicks, and you just want to make sure that they're not broken off. They're designed to dissipate static electricity. In some cases, they'll help with a lightning strike, but mostly they're designed to dissipate static electricity. It's important on the new airplanes that are a lot composite because it's really difficult to get rid of the static electricity. And these static wicks are designed to dissipate that. So
I mean, airplanes are struck by lightning all the time. It's
all the time, and
not
it's
a big
very
deal.
rare that anything bad happens. I mean, there'll be some inspections that are required after a lightning strike. Sometimes it'll burn rivets out. Sometimes it'll leave scorch mark on the airplane. But for the most part anymore, most of the lightning strikes are just not a big deal.
We've got this little pipe here sticking out the back of this bit of the wing. What does that do?
That's part of the fuel jettison system.
Okay.
And we talked about being able to take off with more fuel or more weight than you can land with. So if you land with a great deal of G-force, you can actually damage the airplane if you land overweight. We were dispatched one time out of Chicago where the dump masts were in a wired closed position, so we couldn't dump fuel. And I had great apprehension about taking off that way. And even though if you can take off on a runway, you can come back around and dry the situation and land on that same runway, performance-wise, chances are you're going to either blow the tires or have hot brakes or damage the airplane structurally. And so I was very reluctant to take the airplane all the way to China without the ability to dump. I suggested to the dispatcher that he move that airplane on a route to Europe where you weren't going to take off at max gross weight and you weren't going to have to fly for a long time. I said, you realize, of course, that our first opportunity to land below our max landing weight is over the Aleutian chain. Okay. That's how far we had to fly to burn enough fuel to land at max landing weight.
The Aleutian chain, is that?
It's past Alaska.
Past Alaska. Yeah. So that's halfway around the world, really.
Yeah. It was 3,000 miles, maybe.
Okay.
So if you lost an engine and you wanted to come back around and land, it's probably better to dump some fuel.
All right. And how that works, and we'll show you how all that works.
We'll show you how all that works, and it has a lot of safeguards built into the system.
These little fairings, this is part of the flap mechanism, is that?
Yes,
is that
it is,
correct?
and it just covers up all of the internal guts of the mechanism. That the flaps kind of move back and then down.
Okay,
and
down. All those things do is just make that nice and smooth and add a nice kind of aerodynamic fairing to all that stuff.
Yeah, I teach the Falcon now, and all of that stuff is internal to the wing, and this makes it look pretty gross.
Yeah, it does. And what we've got here is we've got this little bit kind of hanging down here. Well, there's no hydraulic power to the aeroplane.
Right.
What are we seeing here, and why is this bit flapping down?
It's called a flaperon, and it's kind of a combination of flap and aileron. They made the wings so that you could use a combination of spoilers and ailerons and flaperons to make the roll so that you wouldn't get what we call adverse yaw. In a swept-wing airplane, as you create more lift, you create more drag. So if you want to roll to the right, for example, if you bring the left wing up, you're creating more lift. Well, that would tend to move the airplane in that direction because of the adverse yaw. So by destroying some of the lift on the right wing, you can make that happen without creating the adverse yaw.
And am I right in thinking that some of you may recognize this little part because this is the only bit of the Malaysian 777 that went missing? This is the only bit that's been found.
That was the first bit that was found. I guess they found
some more recently.
Just a little more recently, but yeah.
Well, by the time you watch this, they may have found even more still.
Well, that's right. But this was the first piece that was found, and they stamped a part number on each part of the 777, and so they were sure it came from that tail number, and they were sure it came from a 777.
Okay, so. And this is the bit, and you can we all saw the pictures, and it's pretty recognizable
just
part.
Like that. Yeah,
it's a pretty recognizable part.
Yep.
We have another cargo hold. No different to the front one, I guess.
One, right.
These little controls to the right, that's to open and close it, I'm guessing.
Yep.
Here we go. We were talking about you buying a gift for your wife and needing somewhere to put it on the airplane.
Right.
This is, I guess, where it would go along with anything that turned up late.
That's correct. That's where you would load hand luggage that came late or that you didn't want to put in a container.
We have another couple of blanked out windows, I guess, for the same reason that we talked about before.
It could be a lavatory or it could be part of the galley. Either one. It's probably a lavatory in this situation.
Got you.
Just after the door, you see another light. Again, that light, you're looking for the discoloration to make sure that light is not burned out, because that's what's going to illuminate the slide as you come down it.
Got you. And each door has a slide, and each door will pop its own respective slide.
That's correct.
Got you.
And you can detach those slides, all of them, for over water, and they become rafts.
Okay.
They're slide rafts.
All right. So it brings us around to the tail. Now, I'm guessing you can't really see a lot of this from the ground.
Not from the ground, no. I mean, we're up high right now, and notice again that you have a couple lights on the tail. In this model airplane, some airplanes have that, some don't. If the APU is running, that door would be up, and that's where it intakes the air for the APU system. When we see on the other side, that'll be the exhaust system. You're checking to make sure that there's no tail damage, because you can over-rotate this airplane and drag the tail, which is not good.
Boeing have come up with different ways of dealing with this problem over time.
Typically it's a skid, that will protect the tail if it's long enough to need that.
Is it like a can? Is it almost like a kind of like a tin can that compresses?
I mean, that's the theory.
Yeah.
Obviously, if you get it so tail down that you're going to touch that, hopefully that's all you'll get, and that's easily replaceable. But if you get into more of the structure, then that's a bigger job.
That's a big deal.
Yeah.
And in an aeroplane this long, you've got to think about the tail and the rotation, and we'll talk a bit more about that
Absolutely.
when we get to it. We've got the actual the elevators and then the tail bit itself. Is there anything to talk about here?
You're just looking again for some of the static wicks to make sure that the static wicks aren't off the airplane. The elevator, unlike some airplanes on the DC-9, for example, you'll see one up and one down. It just freaks me to death when I see that. In this airplane, they should both be faired with the horizontal stabilizer part of it, and so it should all kind of be flat, and they should be the same.
The rudder itself is kind of canted off, and that's because the hydraulic power switched off.
You don't have any hydraulics on the airplane, and that is the wind obviously is from the right. It's just blown the rudder over, and that's fair.
So when we pressurize the hydraulics, that'll straighten itself up.
It should go straight back, yes. As you look here, you see 3 marks on the side of the fuselage and a mark on the tail. As we trim it for takeoff, then it should be lined up with that middle mark. The top mark and the bottom mark are I believe, the maximum travel.
It's interesting that they mark it on the outside of the airplane. It's not like we can kind of climb out and just go, yeah, we've trimmed for takeoff.
No, but the idea is that as you're walking around, it should be in that range.
It shouldn't be. So if this was pointed below that bottom one or above the top one, then there's something badly wrong somewhere.
Wrong, yeah.
I got you.
So you would want to make sure that you went back into the airplane, and chances are they didn't retrim it after landing or something like that.
I know obviously this depends on the airlines. Which exits are you going to use in this airplane?
Well, typically it would be just as you see it here. It would be the aft, and then it would be the number 2 door on the left-hand side. The number 1 door sometimes gets used. A remote parking in Frankfurt, they will typically come to 1 left and not to 2 left.
So does that mean everyone's got to walk through first class to get onto the airplane? But first class passengers love that.
Yeah, but typically the first class passengers are they're the first off the airplane. So if you're departing off the airplane, then you're probably going to be gone by the time the hoi polloi arrives.
Yeah, exactly. I got you. Yeah. Okay. Then in terms of servicing the airplane?
Typically the catering carts will arrive on the right side of the airplane.
At the front or the back?
And both in many cases, yeah. They're just going to bring it on board, and it's all pre-ordered, and all they do is bring it on in carts, and they install it in the galleys, and there's maybe 10 of those roll-on things that go in each of the galleys.
If we were going on a 15-hour flight, there's going to be a lot of food coming on this airplane for 300 people.
Yeah, and you can have 2 or 3 different meals as well. So yeah, there's an awful lot of food being brought on board.
Let's have a look at a kind of typical turnaround for a pretty long flight. You're going to arrive at the airplane.
Typically, we would arrive 30 minutes before the flight. It's pretty close to being ready to go by the time we get there.
So most of this stuff will have already happened by then.
Yes. that's the goal.
Yeah.
And if it hasn't happened and the fueling isn't done and the galleys aren't loaded and the people aren't on board, you're probably not going to go on time.
Okay.
You would typically cater it just one way, and then when it gets to the other end, what they'll do is they'll clean the airplane, they'll fuel the airplane for the return trip, they'll cater it for the return trip, they'll make sure that everything is ready to go. The headsets and all of the magazines and all that kind of stuff is done, and then the flight crew will be invited on. All the flight attendants will come and do their thing, pass out all the blankets and all the pillows onto the seats, and then after they're finished, then the passengers will come on board, and somewhere around that 30 to 45 minute time frame is when the air crew would arrive.
Just to kind of finish off the walk around, everything on that side is repeated on this side, so we don't need to go in and start talking about everything we had on that side. You got on this side.
No, you're just going to do exactly the same kind of walk around on the left side. You're going to check the main gear, you're going to check the brake pucks, you're going to check the trailing edge, and then as you come forward, there's some more holes in the airplane, and some of those are static ports. The two up just in front of the wing, those two are negative relief valves. And if you land with pressurization on the airplane, that's when those valves will open and dump the pressure so that you don't have a situation where you can't get the doors open.
Okay.
One of the things that, as part of our evacuation process, one of the things that we do is manually depressurize the airplane by opening the outflow valves. We looked at the forward outflow valve, so that's the aft outflow valve. Again, back in the old days, those aft outflow valves, they'd have a streak of nicotine and tar and crap behind them.
All the stuff that was from outside.
Geez.
So you're breathing this in the aeroplane. This is all what's getting sucked out in the slipstream.
It would make you quit smoking if you did.
Yeah, I bet it did. But you don't see that anymore.
No, they're all clean now.
All right. And then we are back at the bottom of the stairs.
Right.
And it's time.
It is time to go on board and look at the fun pilot stuff.